Imagine an army so disciplined, so innovative, and so ruthless that it could crush enemies many times its size, conquer vast empires, and hold together one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. This wasn't an army of chance. It was a war machine forged through extreme strategies that blended cunning, brutality, and genius. From building entire roads in the middle of campaigns, to engineering siege weapons that could tear down city walls, from psychological warfare that terrified enemies before the first sword was drawn, to daring battlefield formations like the Testudo that made soldiers nearly invincible under a rain of arrows, Rome's strategies weren't just about fighting, they were about domination. These weren't the fair, honorable battles you might imagine. Rome fought with patience, deception, and often overwhelming cruelty. To Rome, victory was not about glory alone, it was about survival, expansion, and sending a message that defiance would never be tolerated. In this documentary, we'll uncover the most extreme war strategies of ancient Rome, the clever tricks, the brutal tactics, and the innovations that made Rome an unstoppable force for centuries. Prepare yourself, because this isn't just history, this is the story of how Rome mastered the art of war. The Roman military mindset, war as a way of life. For the Romans, war wasn't just something they did, it was who they were. Unlike many ancient societies that went to war only when forced, Rome saw conflict as a natural extension of its identity. From the earliest days of the Roman Republic, military service was not only expected but also celebrated as the highest duty a citizen could perform. Every Roman citizen was, at heart, a soldier. The Roman elite wore their military experience like a badge of honor, and political careers were built upon successful campaigns. A young Roman aristocrat could not hope to rise to power in the Senate without first proving his courage on the battlefield. War and politics were inseparable, and military success was often the deciding factor in who ruled Rome. This mindset created a society that trained itself for conflict constantly. Boys were raised with the expectation of serving in the legions, learning discipline, endurance, and loyalty from an early age. Roman festivals and public spectacles glorified military victories, while triumphal parades celebrated returning generals, turning them into living legends. To the Romans, peace was not the absence of war, it was merely the time between wars. Expansion was a duty, conquest was a necessity, and the army was the sacred tool through which Rome would fulfill its destiny. This relentless mindset shaped everything about their strategies. Unlike their enemies, who often fought for survival or short-term gain, the Romans fought with a vision, to build an empire that would last forever. It was this philosophy, this belief that Rome existed to conquer, that gave birth to some of the most extreme and ingenious war strategies the world had ever seen. And as we move deeper, we'll see how this mindset transformed ordinary battles into campaigns of total domination. Divide and conquer, Rome's strategy of breaking enemies apart. One of the most extreme and effective strategies the Romans mastered was divide et impera, divide and conquer. Unlike brute force tactics that relied purely on numbers or strength, this strategy was psychological, political, and military all at once. It turned enemies against each other long before swords ever clashed on the battlefield. Rome understood that a united enemy was dangerous, but divided enemies were easy prey. So instead of fighting every opponent at once, they chipped away at alliances, bribed certain leaders, and played rival groups against each other. The goal was always the same: isolate the enemy and destroy them one piece at a time. We see this clearly during the Samnite Wars in Italy. The Romans were surrounded by powerful rivals, the Samnites, the Etruscans, and even the Gauls. But rather than fight them in a grand coalition, Rome used cunning diplomacy to secure temporary peace with some while focusing all its might on others. Once one rival was crushed, Rome quickly turned against their former allies. Over time, every Italian tribe found itself standing alone against the Roman war machine. The genius of this strategy lay in its long-term consequences. Rome didn't just beat enemies, they broke their unity forever. Take the Greek city-states as another example. The Greeks had once united to defeat the Persians, but by the time Rome came knocking, the city-states were too divided by jealousy and mistrust. Rome fueled these rivalries, supporting one side until it was convenient to betray them. In the end, Greece fell not because it lacked courage or culture, but because Rome made sure its people could never fight as one. But divide and conquer wasn't just about politics, it extended onto the battlefield. Roman generals would deliberately split enemy formations, exploiting weak points, and isolating parts of their armies. Once the enemy line was broken, panic spread quickly, and a divided force was easy to annihilate. In essence, Rome turned division into a weapon as powerful as any sword. They understood that if you could break an enemy's unity, you could break their spirit. And once the enemy was fragmented, the Roman legions moved in for the kill. This extreme but clever approach became a cornerstone of Roman success. It wasn't always the largest army that won, but the smartest one. And Rome proved, time and again, that strategy could be deadlier than steel. The Fabian strategy: winning by not fighting. Sometimes the most extreme strategy is the one that looks like cowardice, at least at first glance. The Fabian strategy, named after the Roman general Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, was one of Rome's boldest and most unconventional approaches, winning a war by avoiding battle. The context was dire. Rome faced Hannibal of Carthage, one of the greatest military geniuses in history. After Hannibal crossed the Alps with his elephants and annihilated Roman armies at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most famously at Cannae, Rome was on the brink of destruction. Panic gripped the Republic. Many believed the only way to restore honor was to meet Hannibal in open battle again. But Fabius had a different vision. Instead of charging head-on into Hannibal's superior tactics, Fabius chose patience over pride. His strategy was simple yet radical: avoid direct confrontation. He refused to fight major battles, denying Hannibal the chance to use his brilliance on the battlefield. Harass and exhaust. Roman forces shadowed Hannibal's army, cutting off supplies, ambushing foragers, and burning crops so Hannibal's men starved in hostile territory. Delay, delay, delay. Fabius bet that Hannibal's army, deep in enemy land and far from reinforcements, would eventually weaken on its own. At the time, this approach was deeply unpopular. Romans mocked Fabius, calling him cunctator, the delayer. They saw it as cowardice, a refusal to avenge the massacres Hannibal inflicted. But history would prove Fabius right. By stretching the war out, he bought Rome time to recover, rebuild its armies, and strengthen its defenses. Hannibal's momentum slowed, his resources drained, and his once terrifying invasion began to crumble. The Fabian strategy wasn't flashy. There were no glorious victories, no heroic charges. Instead, it was a war of endurance, discipline, and restraint, a strategy that demanded the courage to be patient when everyone else wanted blood. And in the end, it saved Rome. This extreme tactic taught the world a powerful lesson: sometimes the best way to win is not to fight at all. And for Rome, it proved that survival could be just as legendary as victory. Scorched earth, turning land into a weapon. When most people think of war, they imagine armies clashing, swords striking, and cities under siege. But Rome mastered a far more devastating approach, one that didn't just defeat enemies on the battlefield, but destroyed their very ability to fight at all. This was the scorched earth strategy, the deliberate destruction of food, resources, and land to starve enemies into submission. The logic was brutal but effective. Armies in the ancient world couldn't survive without supplies, and unlike modern times, they couldn't rely on trains, trucks, or planes. They depended on the land, harvesting crops, stealing livestock, or living off local villages. Rome turned this dependency into a weakness. By burning fields, cutting down orchards, poisoning wells, and taking away anything useful, they transformed fertile lands into wastelands. One of the most famous examples comes from the Second Punic War. When Hannibal roamed Italy, the Romans, following Fabius Maximus' advice, torched their own farmlands ahead of him. By denying Hannibal's men food and forcing them to march through desolate territory, Rome slowly weakened one of the most dangerous armies ever to set foot on Italian soil. It wasn't about meeting Hannibal in glorious battle. It was about bleeding him dry without striking a single blow. Another extreme case occurred during Rome's wars with Carthage. After years of bitter struggle, when Rome finally captured Carthage in 146 BC, they didn't just win, they erased. According to legend, the Romans plowed salt into the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. Whether this detail is true or not, the destruction of Carthage stands as the ultimate example of scorched earth, not only defeating an enemy, but making sure they could never rise again. The cruelty of this strategy was undeniable. It often hurt civilians more than soldiers, reducing proud nations to starvation and poverty. But for Rome, it was justified by the end result: total domination. To the Romans, war wasn't about mercy, it was about survival and conquest. And if starving an enemy meant victory, then no field, no farm, and no harvest was safe. The scorched earth strategy revealed the darker side of Roman genius: their willingness to use the land itself as a weapon, even if it meant destroying everything in their path. Psychological warfare. Fear as Rome's sharpest sword. Rome understood something that many of its enemies never fully grasped. Battles are won not only with swords and shields, but with the mind. Fear could break armies before a single spear was thrown. And the Romans became masters of psychological warfare, using intimidation, reputation, and spectacle to weaken their enemies long before combat began. One of the most powerful weapons Rome wielded was its reputation for brutality. When a city resisted Roman rule, the punishment was often so extreme that other cities surrendered without a fight. Entire populations were enslaved, leaders executed, and rebellious towns burned to the ground. The message was clear: defy Rome, and face total destruction. This fear spread across the ancient world, making enemies think twice before challenging Roman authority. The Romans also perfected the art of the spectacle of power. Triumphal parades in Rome showcased chains of captured kings, exotic animals, and piles of stolen treasure. These weren't just celebrations, they were propaganda, designed to remind both citizens and foreigners that Rome was unstoppable. Even distant peoples who never set foot in Rome would hear tales of these spectacles and think of resistance as hopeless. On the battlefield, intimidation was just as important. Roman legions advanced with strict discipline, shields and armor gleaming, moving in unison like a living machine. The sheer sight of such order and strength was terrifying compared to the chaotic, irregular forces of many of their enemies. Their war horns, drums, and marching formations created an atmosphere of doom before the first clash. But perhaps Rome's most chilling psychological weapon was decimation, a punishment inflicted on their own soldiers. If a unit showed cowardice or mutiny, 1 in every 10 men was executed by their comrades. The cruelty of this punishment instilled absolute discipline, ensuring that fear of Rome's own system was greater than fear of any enemy. For opponents, knowing that Roman soldiers feared nothing, not even their own commanders, was deeply unsettling. In the end, Rome proved that fear was as effective as any sword. By making themselves appear invincible, merciless, and eternal, they often won wars before they even began. To fight Rome wasn't just to risk losing a battle, it was to risk losing everything. The double envelopment at Cannae, Rome learns from defeat. The Romans prided themselves on discipline, courage, and strength. But one of the greatest lessons in their history came from a devastating defeat: the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC during the Second Punic War. It was here that Hannibal, commander of Carthage, unleashed one of the most brilliant and extreme battlefield maneuvers in history: the double envelopment. At Cannae, Hannibal's forces were vastly outnumbered. The Romans, confident in their superiority, brought nearly 80,000 men against Hannibal's 50,000. Rome expected a crushing victory. Instead, Hannibal gave them their darkest day. He placed his weakest troops at the center, and his strongest on the flanks. As the Romans pushed forward, eager to break through, Hannibal's center slowly retreated. The Romans believed they were winning, until they realized too late that they were trapped. Hannibal's cavalry had already routed the Roman horsemen and circled around to attack from behind. Meanwhile, his flanks pressed inward, surrounding the Romans in a deadly pocket. What followed was a massacre. Of the 80,000 Roman soldiers, as many as 50,000 to 70,000 were killed in a single day. It was one of the bloodiest battles in ancient history, and it nearly shattered Rome's will to fight. But here lies Rome's genius. They didn't just mourn defeats, they learned from them. Instead of collapsing, Rome studied Hannibal's tactics and eventually adopted the double envelopment strategy for themselves. Years later, they used similar maneuvers to crush enemies in Greece, Spain, and beyond. The lesson of canny became part of Roman military doctrine: never underestimate strategy, and never waste a defeat. For Rome, every loss was a classroom, and every mistake a future weapon. The irony was that Hannibal's brilliance, meant to destroy Rome, instead taught them how to become even more dangerous. The double envelopment was more than just a tactic, it was a turning point. It showed the extremes of ancient warfare, where an entire army could be swallowed whole. And in Rome's hands, it became another step toward building the unstoppable war machine that would dominate the ancient world. Siege warfare, starving cities into surrender. For Rome, battles in the open field were only part of the story. Many of their greatest victories didn't come from head-on clashes, but from the patient, merciless art of siege warfare, a strategy that slowly squeezed the life out of enemy cities until surrender was the only option. Ancient cities relied on high walls, towers, and gates to keep invaders out. To many peoples, these fortifications were symbols of safety. But to Rome, they were simply challenges to be solved. The Romans built some of the most advanced siege technologies of the ancient world: massive battering rams to smash gates, mobile towers taller than city walls, and catapults that hurled stones and fire over defenses. Their engineers could dismantle the strongest fortifications, turning once unbreakable cities into ruins. But Rome's most extreme weapon in siege warfare wasn't machinery, it was time. When direct assaults proved costly, the Romans simply surrounded a city, cutting off supplies of food and water. No one in, no one out. Slowly, hunger and disease did the work for them. Civilians starved, morale collapsed, and even the proudest defenders eventually opened their gates. The siege of Alesia in 52 BC is one of the most famous examples. Julius Caesar faced the Gallic leader Vercingetorix, who had retreated into a fortified stronghold with tens of thousands of warriors. Instead of launching a reckless assault, Caesar built two enormous walls, one circling Alesia to keep the Gauls inside, and another facing outward to stop reinforcements. His men held their ground for weeks as starvation ravaged the defenders. Eventually, Vercingetorix had no choice but to surrender, marking the end of Gallic resistance. Another chilling example was the siege of Masada in 73 CE. Jewish rebels had barricaded themselves on a nearly unreachable mountain fortress. The Romans, unwilling to accept defiance, built a massive ramp of earth and stone up the mountainside, a feat of engineering that still stuns historians today. When the Romans finally broke through, they found the defenders had chosen mass suicide over capture, an extreme testament to the terror Rome inspired. For Rome, siege warfare was more than a tactic, it was psychological domination. Cities learned that walls could not protect them, and resistance only delayed the inevitable. By perfecting the art of the siege, Rome made it clear, no fortress, no matter how strong, could withstand the might of the legions. Rome's naval warfare, dominating the seas. While the Roman legions ruled the land, Rome also understood that true supremacy required control of the seas. Many of Rome's enemies, especially Carthage, with its proud seafaring tradition, believed Rome was too land-focused to ever become a naval power. But Rome proved them wrong by turning the Mediterranean into what they proudly called Mare Nostrum, our sea. At the start of the First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC, Rome had almost no navy. Carthage, on the other hand, commanded hundreds of advanced warships. The Romans were outmatched, but instead of accepting defeat, they did what they always did best: adapt and innovate. According to legend, when a Carthaginian ship ran aground, the Romans copied its design plank by plank, building a fleet almost overnight. But Rome didn't just imitate, they improved. They invented the corvus, a boarding bridge with a deadly spike that could be dropped onto enemy ships. This turned sea battles into land battles, where Rome's disciplined soldiers had the advantage. Suddenly, Rome's legions could fight on the water as if they were on solid ground. This innovation turned the tide. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, the Romans stunned Carthage by capturing dozens of ships using the corvus. Over the decades, Rome's naval power only grew stronger. They mastered ramming tactics, trained fleets to move in perfect coordination, and eventually defeated Carthage at the Battle of the Aegates Islands, 241 BCE, forcing Carthage to surrender Sicily, the first major province of Rome's growing empire. Naval dominance didn't stop with Carthage. During the wars with Macedon and Greece, Roman fleets cut off supplies and reinforcements, ensuring victory on land. Later, Pompey the Great launched a lightning-fast naval campaign that wiped out Mediterranean piracy in just 3 months, restoring Rome's control of vital trade routes. By controlling the seas, Rome ensured that its armies could move swiftly, its grain supplies from Egypt could flow uninterrupted, and its enemies could never regroup overseas. What began as Rome's weakness became one of its greatest strengths. Through naval warfare, Rome proved its adaptability once again. They could take an area where they had no experience, learn faster than their enemies, and turn the tide of history. In the end, the Mediterranean didn't just connect Rome's empire, it belonged to Rome. Total war, Rome's policy of annihilation. For Rome, war was never just a skirmish or a short-term fight. In extreme cases, it became total war, a strategy aimed at completely destroying an enemy, leaving nothing behind to rise again. Unlike limited conflicts, total war demanded complete mobilization of armies, resources, and often entire populations. Rome's enemies learned that to defy the Republic, or later the Empire, was to risk extinction. One of the most infamous examples is the Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BC, against Carthage. After decades of rivalry, Rome decided that Carthage could never again threaten them. The Romans laid siege to the city, destroyed its fortifications, and after capturing it, allegedly plowed salt into the soil to prevent anything from growing. The survivors were sold into slavery, and the city was erased from the map, a chilling demonstration of total war. Another extreme case was the destruction of Corinth in 146 BC. Corinth, a wealthy Greek city-state, rebelled against Roman authority. The Roman army stormed the city, killing thousands, enslaving women and children, and burning Corinth to the ground. The message was unmistakable: resistance would not be tolerated. Rome's use of total war combined military, political, and psychological strategies. By annihilating enemies completely, they sent a message across the ancient world: challenge Rome, and there would be no mercy. These campaigns weren't just victories, they were warnings, carefully calculated to secure dominance far beyond the battlefield. Rome's extreme genius. From disciplined legions and psychological terror to scorched earth, naval mastery, and total annihilation, Rome's extreme war strategies were unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. They didn't just win battles, they controlled minds, reshaped landscapes, and erased cities. Rome's genius lay in its adaptability, its patience, and its relentless pursuit of victory. It combined courage with cunning, brutality with strategy, and tradition with innovation. Through centuries of warfare, Rome didn't just build an empire, it built a legend, a blueprint for military dominance that would influence generations to come. In the end, the story of Rome is a story of extremes: extreme discipline, extreme innovation, extreme cruelty, and extreme effectiveness. And it is this combination that made Rome one of the most feared and admired powers in history, a force that turned war into both art and science.